Thanks, Peter. That feels like an opportune moment to open up to questions from the floor, if there are any, because I realise we're coming on tight for our time. Yes, Andrew.
Just shout?
Yeah, just shout, I think.
Sorry,
Hi everyone, thanks for a really good discussion. I'm just starting from RSPB Scotland. So I just wanted to ask the panel, in a short time, in a very quick summary, what would be the biggest thing that you think could help mainstream agroecology across the farming sector, whether that be from business, from government, from individuals? Who do you see as having the biggest sort of say in that transition?
Does anyone want to tackle that one?
The question was, how do you, sorry, Denise asking how do you promote that, how do you see it?
Yeah, that's great. Amongst the farming community, how can we mainstream agroecology across that sort of?
Well, I think, and it comes back to the definition of agroecology, and it's how you 100% define that. I think it's already happening, and I think the industry as a whole are looking at agroecology, but I would suggest that what we're doing at home, although, Denise is quite critical of the fact that I'm using glyphosate, I think because of the way we're working the system, and this is not about a one-size-fits-all, because every farm and croft in Scotland is completely different. Now, we don't have very fertile soil, we have very, very shallow soil, but what we're doing at home just now is improving that soil health and improving that organic matter. Yes, we're using glyphosate, but we're seeing a massive difference and benefit in the productivity and the soil health that's happening. Now, I think that's happening already, and through government policy, there's a shift in that, and we're seeing that, and that's how we can actually incentivise more people to be more focused on that. What we're really lacking, and this is about, and we don't want to rewind the clock and look at what we did in past times, but our sort of fathers before us probably paid more attention to soil health than what we've been doing right now, and particularly looking at lime. The pH of the soil is so important. We've had a big lack in that, and looking at concentrating in that. I'm not saying that's the case right across the board, but there's a lot of agriculture in Scotland not paying enough attention to looking at soil health, and I think that's going to shift.
Martin, I wasn't criticising us. I was inviting you to join the party.
Well, that's different.
It was interesting for me personally. I've been on this journey for a long time, but the grouping that came together under the 1.5 committee, which Nourish, in fact the two gentlemen behind it are sitting right here actually, helped to steer it. All the individual actions you would call agroecological, that were identified by a whole bunch of different people from the NGOs and academics and farmers. I don't think that term was necessarily used, but if you were to describe each individual action to solve that little bit of problem, you would call it agroecological. So the industry is on that journey, whether it realises it or not, and it'll be all the players, the government, the markets, etc., will pull us that way, and I think that's an excellent thing.
But also kind of just demonstrating that an agroecological approach, which is actually about reducing inputs, makes profit margins stronger. So if you can demonstrate within any industry that actually they can control profit margins, it's not productivity at all costs, it's actually profit margin management by reducing inputs. And reducing inputs for farming automatically benefits biodiversity and climate because you're reducing agrochemicals. So that's the way to actually demonstrate the benefit in scaling up.
If I was to suggest one thing, it would be to run a leadership program or a development program for some of the key gatekeepers in this process. So we've seen lots of places from Tesco's and Morrison's and people like this. They have a very small number of buyers. But in my view, a lot of those buyers don't actually understand what we're talking about here. Because they've been taught to buy on price. They're now being given net zero targets, but they don't, and nature, blah, blah, blah. But they don't necessarily have a real understanding what that means. Similarly, when you look at the big catering companies, Compass, Sodexo, a relatively small number of buyers who have a huge influence. We've been doing some work with one of the big agricultural banks, training their relationship managers to understand some of this stuff, so that when they're talking to farmers, they understand what it is we're talking about, and they can have a conversation with farmers about it. So there's a relatively small number of very important gatekeepers in the process. I think the government's serious about wanting to pivot farming in Scotland more towards climate and nature, they should be supporting ECCI or one of the universities to really provide some high-level, inclusive education for those people, because their bosses need them to be doing a better job, so that they can actually understand, well, what is Nigel, what is mine doing this farm, what is, I keep calling Nigel to Nigel Kennedy, I'm sorry, and that violin concerto that goes to my head all the time. So, and and what Denise doing on the farm, what Andrew doing on the farm. Actually, most of the people who are buying most of our food haven't ever been to a farm, let alone understand what goes on farms. Because what they're buying is pig meat, Brazil, pig meat, Korea, pig meat, Netherlands, pig meat, Denmark, pig meat, Scotland, or Scotland's too expensive. That's what they're doing, right? So we've got to understand that if we can influence those gatekeepers, then we can start to build something together so that they understand what it is everybody's trying to do.
Thank you, Pete. And I'm afraid we've run right over time, so I'm going to have to. Is there one more question? Can we squeeze one more in? Very quickly.
Thanks very much. I'm Lucy Ransom. I work for McKay Community Food Network. I work with underserved communities in McKay having to grow food and for a sustainable food system. Really interesting discussion. Thank you. Really value all your contributions. What I'm hearing is, we need less inputs, we need to localise the food system. Around the world, the majority of food actually comes from small-scale producers. That's the majority where the world's food comes from. How can we make that happen as more of a common thing in Scotland? I mean, in Glasgow, there's lots of mini-market gardens now and localised food systems. I think that's what we need much, much more of, rather than bigger scale farms or even medium scale farms, to relocalise that for young people. You kept talking about young people coming back in. How do we do that to make that more attractive, interesting, and that's how you educate local communities?
We need more processing. We need more processing units. We need more abattoirs, more processing units to localise the food chain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's right across, and it's not just about livestock, it's right, and that's why we have it at the minute, and that's why we have to transport livestock further than we've had to do before, because the only way that small processing and small abattoirs can actually function is to be profitable as well, and the costs for small processors is too much, and that's why everything's centralised. And that's a problem. That's actually back down to the price of food. It's been driven down because the low cost of food, there's not enough margin in it for these smaller processors to, because you're 100%, I totally agree. We're fortunate we're not that far from an abattoir. We do 60 lambs in boxes every year. We've now started selling some of the Highland cattle in boxes, and that's fantastic because we're going straight to the consumer. But there's a lot of areas in Scotland, it's just too far to go to get that to happen. And that's what we should be trying to do, but we can't do that without local processing. And that's something that governments could try and help to try and drive forward.
I hear you, that's coming from a kind of point of view of eating meat, but the younger generation are hugely onto the vegan bandwagon, and you can get loads of great sources of protein from plant-based sources. So how are we going to localise the plant-based sources of food into local communities more? That, it's happening, but how do we encourage it more?
Do we processing units for veg?
Yes,
Dehusking for beans. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly easy with veg because generally the degree of processing is less. We're certainly very keen to see an investment in controlled environment greenhouses on our brownfield sites in remote island areas, create year-round stable employment, producing the sort of veg which we can't produce in the field in Scotland, but that we import at actually huge water costs, but also huge human rights costs in terms of some of the working conditions for some of the veg that we import at the moment. So I think there's real opportunities there. But just to say, I think there's obviously young people, there's a lot of noise about veganism. If you actually look at the numbers, meat consumption is declining very, very slowly. And the difficulty is that there's a lot of people pushing chicken as being a sustainable alternative. And a lot of young people think that's the right thing to do. And I do think it's really difficult if you've ever, most people who eat chicken have never seen a chicken. The sort of chicken they eat because they think they're little brown things that scratch around the dirt, and they're nothing like that. They're weird, And most people have never seen the animal that they eat most of, right? That is weird, right? Who here's been inside a broiler house? Sandy? Ever been in a broiler house? No. No, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Yeah. But it's a very different thing from what we think it is, all right? And yet that's what we're being told we should eat, you know. And Anthony's lambs that run around on the trees and, you know, have a good time are seen as a problem. So I think we do have a big issue there.
I also think that there is a cultural problem in certainly the community I live in. The loss of skills in growing food yourselves, the business of people's having their work schedules. I don't know. It's the way that people live. It's so different. And in my lifetime, a huge amount of skills have been lost, and a huge amount of local food. Every household had the skills to grow much of their own food and had the space to grow food. Why has that been lost? And if that's a rural community, that's not an urban community. But I suspect urban communities have some parallel situations. Forgive me, I've never lived in a town.
I think we've got a huge issue of disconnect about where our food comes from, and I think we're so far disconnected. As Pete said, nobody knows where it comes from now, and I think that's what. And this is a real frustration of mine, that if climate change is at the top of the agenda, the environment is at the top of the agenda, agriculture's looking after 75% of the land in Scotland. Food security, we need to know where it comes from. Why are we not talking about this in schools? Because the STEM subjects that's involved in agriculture right now is phenomenal. The science and technology that's getting used in agriculture now is mind-blowing. We're talking about using GPS systems to put variable rate applications throughout agriculture, whether it's like whatever products you're using. The best genetic technology that's getting used to breed efficient animals in the right manner. We're talking about genetics to try and produce lower methane emitting animals. I mean, all this genetic, we should be talking about that in schools. I can't understand it. All these subjects at the top of the agenda, and yet we're not talking about it.
Okay, we have to wrap up there, I'm afraid. It's been an excellent discussion.
I was just going to say, it's like, sorry.
I'm getting it.
Sorry. I just think like what we're talking about, we're talking about meat and we're talking about just like the connect is like food and agriculture and all the other like systems are actually so like connected to that, and why that isn't like connected within like the government and what we're doing. Like it's just, and it's like it also brings in like transport. All the things are all interconnected, so I don't understand how they don't realise that, but also, like, I think there's a big thing around, like, the food that we eat is, like Pete was saying, it's a load of rubbish. A lot of it is a load of rubbish, and if there was more tax on the rubbish food, but it is like a way of making, like, good food into rubbish to make money, so that's what we need to do, is to, like, turn that around, like, and be like, why are we feeding people rubbish, making them ill, and costing us money for someone to make money out of it? It's just crazy, and that's how we can't see that. I think it's just that's the biggest problem. So if we could tax the rubbish food and make the food that's good for us like cheaper, we need to also be able to cook that food, to make that change. And I just think you guys are really great, and thanks very much.
One thing we need to do is just to thank our panellists for giving up their time and sharing their expertise and knowledge with us. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you.